Back in the days when I was in elementary school, almost every PE class involved playing different team sports or running for time. But no matter what we did, the last 5-10 minutes before the school bell were always reserved for the stretching part. Our teacher would always say that this would help us avoid sore muscles the next day. Back then I really didn't like it. Playing basketball, my biggest passion at the time, was way more exciting. Plus, I hated the pain of trying to touch the floor with straight legs. To me, it just felt like pointless suffering. With time and as I gained more experience and knowledge, my opinion on stretching completely changed. And now I see it in totally different light. In this video, I'd like to share the benefits of stretching and, most importantly, how it goes hand in hand with skills in calisthenics. Let's start with a simple breakdown of the stretching process. First, stretching begins by lengthening the muscle tendon unit. This triggers both neurological and mechanical changes in the body. These changes depend on how strong the stretch is, how long it lasts, and how often you do it. Over time, this can lead to improved flexibility, either temporary or long-term. So there are 4 main types of stretching, each defined by its technique and effect on the body. These methods are applied depending on the goal, situation, and individual needs. First, we have static stretching. This involves holding a stretching position for a specific duration, allowing muscles to gradually lengthen. Secondly, there is dynamic stretching, a series of controlled movements that actively increase the range of motion and prepare the body for physical activity. Third, we come to PNF, a more advanced technique that combines muscle contraction and relaxation to enhance flexibility and strength. Lastly, there is ballistic stretching, characterized by fast bouncing movements aimed at pushing the body beyond its typical range of motion. Regardless of the type of stretching, every movement falls into one of 2 categories, static or dynamic. But that's not all. Each stretch is also either active, where you use your own muscles to create movement or hold a position, or passive, where an external force assists in the stretch. A stretch is never simply static by itself. It's always either static active or static passive. The same goes for dynamic stretching. It always involves either active control or an external influence, passive. While doing research for this episode, I came across this meta-analysis published in Sports Medicine, which examines the long-term effects of static stretching on muscle strength, power, and flexibility. The study found that regular static stretching led to small but noticeable improvements in muscle strength and power, especially in less active and older individuals. Strength gains were more pronounced when the stretching routines included a higher number of repetitions per session. Additionally, flexibility improved significantly, with greater effects observed in longer and more frequent stretching sessions. So overall, the findings suggest that incorporating static stretching into a training routine can be beneficial for enhancing strength, power, and mobility. When it comes to combining strength training with stretching, this study found that dynamic stretching is more beneficial as a part of a warm-up before physical activity due to its positive effects on performance, while static stretching is better suited for post-workout recovery or separate sessions focused on improving flexibility. Now that we understand what stretching actually is, let's take a look at how it applies to real calisthenics skills, starting with the V-sit. This is a perfect example of how mobility and strength often need to work together. I chose this skill first because I previously analyzed this movement on my Instagram, comparing 2 different approaches. Let's take a look at these 2 images. Both show the V-sit, but you've probably noticed that the first athlete's hips are positioned higher than those of the second athlete. For the sake of this example, let's assume that in both cases the center of gravity is slightly above the hips, at the same spot. Another noticeable difference is that the first athlete has to lean back more. I named this the force-dominant approach because maintaining this position requires significant strength, primarily in shoulder extension. The angle between the arm and torso is around 60 degrees, which not only demands high strength, but also results in a deep chest stretch. We can also observe that the compression angle, the angle between the legs and torso, is approximately 80 degrees. This means the athlete's legs are not as fully stretched compared to the second approach, which we'll discuss shortly. The V-seat in this form is much less commonly seen. So to sum it up, this variation requires less flexibility but demands greater strength. Stretch-dominant approach. In contrast, this approach requires significantly less strength than the first one. Notably, there is a high level of compression, with the legs almost touching the chest. Additionally, this athlete leans back less than the previous one, meaning the forces are more evenly distributed across the body. This presentation of the V-seat is seen much more often than the force-dominant approach. I believe that developing the necessary flexibility for the V-seat alongside building the required strength is a much easier and faster way to achieve this skill. On the other hand, relying solely on strength without improving flexibility makes the process considerably more difficult and time-consuming. As an interesting addition, let's consider a hypothetical scenario. If we took the force-dominant approach and increased the compression to match that of the second athlete, we would likely end up with something resembling an extremely difficult and high-level skill in gymnastics and calisthenics, a manna. Of course, we can't say for certain that simply combining the strength of the first athlete with the flexibility of the second would automatically result in achieving this skill. However, this comparison alone gives insight into the difficulty of the force-dominant approach. Having good flexibility, especially a well-developed side split, can make progressions towards certain advanced static skills slightly easier. In particular, it helps with skills that rely on shifting the body's lever upward and holding the position, such as the planche, front lever, and some others. Let's once again compare two examples, this time focusing on the straddle planche position. Once again, let's assume that both athletes have their center of mass in the same position, meaning their bodies are equally balanced. Looking at the first athlete, we can see that he requires less forward lean than the second athlete. This suggests that this version falls into the stretch-dominant category, meaning it demands less force from the key muscles. What stands out is the athlete's leg spread angle. Due to greater flexibility and a wider leg position, his center of mass shifts upward toward the torso. Now moving on to the second athlete, here we notice a greater forward lean, which requires more force from the main muscles. Due to his smaller leg spread, his center of mass is lower. This version can be classified as the force-dominant approach. Bringing it all together, both positions are clearly recognizable as a straddle planche, a skill many calisthenics athletes work toward. While it serves as an important progression toward the full planche, it's also a valuable skill on its own. If your goal is to eventually achieve the full planche, mastering both variations would be very helpful. I chose to compare these two versions of the straddle planche to highlight how better flexibility, allowing for a wider straddle, can make the skill slightly easier due to a small change in leverage. So at the end, it's fair to say more straddle equals less struggle. In gymnastics, the straddle planche is a recognizable static strength element that contributes to the difficulty score. According to the FIG code of points, it is classified as an A difficulty skill on both the floor and the rings. To be counted, it must be held for at least 2 seconds. And now here is a fun fact for you. There is no specific rule regarding the width of the leg spread. This means that theoretically, you could perform a straddle planche with your leg spread as wide as a full split, as long as you maintain proper form and control. In fact, you will often notice how an exceptional level of flexibility in gymnasts directly contributes to their performance in skills like this one. Their ability to reach extreme ranges of motion, like full splits, doesn't just look impressive, it actually gives them more efficiency and makes certain elements more accessible. The handstand, a skill that partially led me into the world of calisthenics. I think it's the most recognizable static skill, if not the most iconic one. When people who aren't into calisthenics see someone holding a handstand, they often assume it's one of the hardest skills. Standing on just your hands looks impressive and naturally grabs attention. On the other hand, a skill like the full planche might not create the same level of surprise, even though it's extremely difficult. The handstand simply has that wow factor. Moving on to the main topic of this episode, mobility, many people who are just starting to hold a handstand for 5-10 seconds won't immediately focus on achieving a perfectly straight line. At this stage, simply increasing hold time is the main priority. I remember exactly how it felt when I managed to hold my first handstand. Back then, technique didn't matter to me at all. However, once increasing handstand endurance is no longer the main focus, the next step in progression could be refining into the so-called perfect handstand, one that maintains a flawless straight line form and looks aesthetically clean. One of the most common issues among beginner handstand practitioners is the banana handstand. This occurs when the chest is tight and lacks mobility, causing the back to arch. While practicing cleaner handstands against a wall is especially important in the early stages, I believe that mobility training should also be a key part of the process from the start. One of the best exercises to address this issue, in my opinion, is the butcher's block stretch. It specifically targets the areas needed for a proper handstand, mainly the chest, lats and triceps. In my case, it turned out to be extremely effective and gave me a much better understanding of what needs to be activated in order to make my handstand straighter. Another big advantage of this exercise is that it allows for progression, specifically by moving your feet farther back, which increases the lever length. This means you are progressing not only by gradually extending the duration of the hold, but also by making the position more challenging through a longer lever. A great aspect of this variation is that it requires you to actively engage your core muscles to stabilize your body, just like you need to do in a proper handstand. That's why I believe stretching in the context of handstand training is important, not just for improving range of motion, but especially if you want to unlock more advanced skills later on, like handstand push-ups, which should be performed with proper technique to minimize the risk of unnecessary injuries. In this video, I presented 3 skills where simply having better mobility brings you a little bit closer to achieving them. I believe that overall flexibility training brings many benefits. One of them is improved range of motion, which supports progress in both beginner and advanced training. But most importantly, it's about enjoying the process. So take the time to explore and find exercises and techniques that suit you and your goals. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. If you have any thoughts or feedback about this episode, feel free to share them in the comments. Thanks again.